What's up, everybody? Pastor Matt here. Thanks for checking into the YouTube channel. Today, we're going to delve into the history of the King James Bible. I'm sure you love the King James. I personally love the King James, though I came to it sort of late in life, believe it or not. I went to a large kind of mega church in Akron where we used the New International Version. And to some degree, we were kind of told to stay away from the King James. It was hard to understand and difficult to really understand what the words meant. And so we all used the NIV. And then later in life, I came to love and appreciate the King James. Personally, I use it for my devotions very, very regularly, though I don't preach from it. I preach from the ESV here at Gospel Fellowship PCA. But we have the opportunity today to talk to a person who has devoted much of their life to studying the King James Version, its background, its history. And so I want to welcome Timothy Berg to my channel today. Timothy, what's up, my man? How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. I'm honored to be here. Thanks so much for letting me speak with you and speak to those that are listening.
Yeah. Hey, and before we go any further, let me just take a moment to say congratulations to you and your new wife. You just got married. You want to drop some news to us here?
Yeah, man, absolutely. Thanks so much. Did just recently have the wedding ceremony with my beautiful wife. We actually eloped back in January to get things officially and legally set up before we went overseas. But we ended up able to do the ceremony in Iceland, which is
Cool.
where she has always wanted to get married. In fact, she's not in here, so I can say this. I mean, I would say it anyway. I love her. But she had told me when we were dating, kind of jokingly, she said, "You know what? If you don't marry me in Iceland, you don't get to marry me." And I
Wow.
said, "Well, I want to marry you, so I'll marry you in Iceland." It wasn't actual ultimatum like that, but yeah, we were blessed of the Lord to be able to travel over to Iceland and do the wedding that she has always wanted there in a beautiful little black chapel, and then got to spend 2 weeks there honeymooning and just looking at honestly some of the most beautiful scenery that I have ever seen. And I'm allowed to brag about it, so you can come to my Facebook page if you'd like and peruse loads and loads of what I happen to think are the most beautiful wedding photos that have ever been taken. And I'm not biased at all. I'm completely an objective observer to that. No, but I am loving marriage, absolutely loving marriage. I have learned more and more. It is a great gift from God. And I'm grateful to him every single day for giving me the woman of my dreams.
Yeah, if I can tease you a little bit, I did see some of those pictures on Facebook, and I
Mm.
honestly thought I had stumbled onto some advertisements for the Bachelor television program or something like that. It looks like you guys have like this fantasy wedding that
Mm.
somebody put on there, and I was kind of scrolling through. I'm like, I don't follow the Bachelor. What's going on here? That whoever did your pictures is awesome. They're really, really some pretty cool.
Man, it blew my mind actually, all that went into it. The photographer there, he basically right after the wedding took us for, I don't know, 4 or 5 hours. And he had told us ahead of time this is what he was going to do. So we told our guests, we had about a dozen people or maybe 15 or 16 people that traveled over and joined us, family and friends. And we told him, if you want to follow us, this guy knows some of the most beautiful spots on the island. And he's just going to real rapidly drive us to each of those spots, take photos, and then move on. So we had kind of a little tour with a train of people following us around to a bunch of spots in Iceland. Got to see all the sites and just take some quick photos and then move on. It was a really intense, but really beautiful thing.
Well, that is awesome, and I encourage people to go check out those really cool photographs. But today we're going to talk about the King James Version of the Bible. And again, if you're new to this channel, my name is Matthew Everhard. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship Presbyterian Church. We are a Reformed Bible-believing church here in Western Pennsylvania. We love Jesus. We're on a mission to share the good news of the gospel with the whole world. So if you're anywhere north of Pittsburgh, come check us out on the Lord's Day. We worship at 8:30 and 11 on Sundays. We'd love to have you come visit us in real life. Timothy, what church are you going to now? You want to promote your local congregation for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we may talk about this a little bit more later. I actually grew up in fundamentalism in the IFB. And so for most of my life was in IFB churches. And then a parting of ways was sort of brought up on me primarily because of my study of the King James and where that led me to. And I went searching for a new church, and the Lord brought me to Bridgeway Church in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, where Sam Storms at the time was the lead pastor and had been for years. And I've been at Bridgeway for, I want to say 9 years now. I'm not always great with dates, so I could be wrong. We actually have just undergone a transition. A lot of people would know Sam Storms' name, but he has just recently stepped into the role of pastor emeritus, which is the first
Cool.
time we've ever given that role to any elder. So he'll continue to write, and he's going to continue to publish some of his books, but no longer engaged in the weekly preaching and pastoral ministry. And Michael Roundtree has just a few weeks ago stepped now full-time into that role. People might know him from Remnant Radio and the interviews that he does. So we've really been blessed at Bridgeway with just some really incredibly gifted expository preachers. And it blesses my soul every week for years to hear Sam and then now to hear Michael. We would welcome anyone that wants to come to stop and join us. We have a 9 o'clock a.m. service and then an 11 o'clock or 11:15 second service. We also have community groups, like a small group setting that meet all throughout the week in different places. We would love to plug any one of you into a spot like that. So by all means, if you're in the Oklahoma City area, or if you're just traveling through, stop by, shoot me a message on Facebook, and I'll try and meet up with you and we can chat, maybe even get a cup of coffee or something. I would love to meet anyone that's watching.
That sounds awesome. So let's get into the King James Version here just for a little bit. How did you come to become such an expert on the King James Bible? You have a blog that we're going to promote here in a little bit, but you've been researching, you've been writing, you've been doing some videos and other content. How did you get so interested in the history of the King James Version?
Yeah, man, that's a great question. For me, it was my background and learning to search things out for myself. So I was raised in, I don't like to use this terminology, but it was the terminology we used then. I was raised in a King James only setting, very firmly King James only home and family life. My mom was an author in that movement. So she's written at least one book, maybe two, depending on how you count, books promoting the idea that the King James Bible is absolutely verbally perfect, given by inspiration of God, and that it's the only Bible that we should use. I went to Bible college and looked for a Bible college that had precisely those similar ideas. And so I attended Heartland Baptist Bible College and did my diploma equivalent of a BA there, and then entered into their grad school as well and did 2 years of their graduate, again, equivalent diploma rather than an accredited degree. I think it was probably during grad school, I started asking lots of questions and started wondering, man, is what I've been taught true? And I sat down and really for the first time in my life started to study the history behind the King James Bible, the history behind the Greek textual basis behind the King James Bible, the Textus Receptus, and how that all developed. And just as I was digging into that history, and as I was digging into the Bible itself, I had been taught a certain view of preservation, and I was sitting there, I was engaged, preaching several times a week at that point in different locations at Southwest with the youth. I worked with youth there for about 14 years. And in the course of just preaching through text after text after text, I would come to texts that I had always been taught were the background of why we believed the King James Bible was perfect and verbally without error. Psalms 12:6-7, preached through the Sermon on the Mount. So I came through Matthew 5:18 and each of those texts. And by the time I was done, I was sitting down and looking at all these texts and going, I don't think they teach what I've been told that they teach. And as I was sitting down and studying the King James Bible's history, I began to realize, man, what I've been taught about how the King James was created and how it came about is just not true. So I first came to the study really more looking to answer my own questions. And as a result, left King James onlyism, and then a parting of ways was kind of forced upon me, and I ended up leaving fundamentalism and the IFB. But as a result of that, the Lord just developed in my heart what had started initially as curiosity to find out what I should believe became really an academic passion. And today I just love studying the King James Bible. I love writing about it, love its history, love holding in my hands some of the documents that helped to shape it. And I've had opportunity to do that a few times and hope to continue to study it. I currently am finishing an MDiv at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. I'm an online student, but I do hope to do a PhD after that will focus specifically on the textual basis behind the King James Version New Testament. So I love studying it. The Lord in his providence brought me from a background where I was kind of forced to in order to come to a healthier view. And then as a result of that, just developed a love for the King James Bible and its history in my life.
Well, we'll have to be careful with some terms today. As Timothy kind of mentioned, some people call themselves King James Version only, and they will ascribe that terminology to themselves. Other people use the King James Version exclusively, but do not call themselves the King James Version only. So some people have different takes on whether or not that term is appropriate, though there are certainly some people out there who would hold those positions. And there is a variety of positions within that entire scope or continuum. But let's talk about the Bible itself, the King James Version Bible itself. Now, some people may actually be surprised to know that the King James Version is not the original or the first English translation of the Bible. Some people may think that, but obviously there were English versions that preceded it. What do you know, Timothy, about some of those prior versions, the Tyndale, the Geneva Bible, etc.?
Yeah, man, that's a really good question. And it is an assumption that can easily take place. I don't fault anyone who's been raised on the King James for thinking that the King James was the first Bible. I remember I was teaching on the King James one time at a church that was just sort of slowly leaving King James onlyism, and that was what they referred to themselves as. And I held up one of the facsimiles of Tyndale, which was a 1526 translation of the New Testament, the very first time the New Testament was translated into English from the Greek text. And I held that up, and the guy literally in the middle of the teaching spoke audibly out loud. He's like, "No way, there was a Bible before the King James." Like, it just shocked him.
Yeah.
Fortunately, most people are better informed, but yeah, English translation had a long history before the King James Version came about. William Tyndale was a scholar who had a passion to put the Bible into the language of the people. At that time, the medieval church, the liturgy had always been in Latin, and the scripture text was in Latin translation, what we call today the Latin Vulgate. And unfortunately, that wasn't the language of the people. That was kind of the language of the elite and the aristocracy. So you could come to church and hear the biblical text read, but have no idea what it meant, which was really unfortunate. And William Tyndale had a passion to bring the Bible into English. Now, there were some English translations that had floated around before, especially what we call the Wycliffe versions. They were translations, though, into English from the Latin Vulgate. So the Bible's originally written in Hebrew and Greek, then it had been translated into Latin, and through the process of 1,000 years of transmission, somewhat corrupted more, and then translated from Latin into English. So that was kind of a really muddy project. And there were kind of more literal Wycliffe versions and less literal Wycliffe versions. They divide into two different groups. But Tyndale had a passion to go back to the original text. He wanted to go back to the original Greek. He loved the work that Erasmus of Rotterdam had done, and he wanted to bring that into English. And he tried initially to do it in England, and then came to the conclusion that England just wouldn't allow it. England had the constitutions of Oxford in place at the time that actually made it illegal to own even a scrap of translation of the Bible in English, which was unique in Reformation history. That wasn't the case in the Continental Reformation. But in England, because of some of the background of the Lollards and Lollardy, it had become illegal to own an English Bible. But Tyndale had this passion that people should be able to hear God speak in their language and know and understand what he said. So he made it kind of his life's work. He traveled to learn Hebrew and study from rabbis, learned Greek exceptionally well, translated the entire New Testament from Greek into English, published that. Well, he published a first run in 1525, but got interrupted as he was being chased. Again, this is an illegal endeavor for him at the time. So I think the first 22 chapters of Matthew, if I remember right, were finished in the Cologne fragment. But then in 1526, finally was able to publish an entire translation of the whole New Testament from Greek into English, which was the very first time that had ever happened. And it gave us really the foundations of our English Bible in a very real sense. All of the English translations that come after Tyndale are riding on the work of Tyndale. So Tyndale did his work. A number of other people came along later and revised it. Miles Coverdale completed the first translation of the entire Bible into English, mostly by taking Tyndale's work and then filling in some gaps where Tyndale wasn't able to finish a large chunk of the Old Testament. Then political groups got a little bit more involved. And so there was official Bibles promoted by the English settlement. The Great Bible came about in that fashion, and it was a huge, big, massive folio, large folio edition meant for pulpit reading, and also sort of emblematic of the establishment's attempt to control the biblical text a little bit. There was response against that, and many people are familiar with the Geneva Bible that popped up in a New Testament was published by William Whittingham in 1557, and then an entire New Testament an entire Bible in 1560, and that was actually produced off the continent. If you think back to English history, we know that Mary Tudor during her reign was adamantly Catholic and promoted a Catholic agenda and left really no room in her land for Protestants. So there were a group of exiles that fled from England to Geneva, and in Geneva is where they completed this project, which ultimately was brought back into England. So then you have kind of an establishment Bible floating around in the Great Bible. You have this reactionary Puritan Bible floating around in the Geneva. and there was a desire for more uniformity. And so eventually that brought us to the King James Bible of 1611. But yeah, lots of English translation work was done before the King James, and the King James Bible was definitely standing on the shoulders of giants, if that answers your question.
Yeah, now my understanding is that the Tyndale Bible, it was greatly influential for all of the English translations that followed after it, in terms of he being one of the first to really just kind of set the trajectory for how phraseology is going to be laid down in various texts. And a number of the early English Bibles actually depend quite heavily on Tyndale's work. Is that your
Yeah, that is
operating
exactly right.
assumption as well?
I would say today translations are kind of done in two different ways. There are some people that take revisions that sort of stand still in that line of Tyndale's work. So for example, the ESV very consciously stands in that tradition and tries to retain as much of Tyndale's wording as is feasible for the modern era and kind of the modern language that we speak today. There are other translations like the NIV that seek to have a completely fresh start, to not base themselves on prior English work and to just translate freshly from a Greek and Hebrew text. But even when they do that, large chunks of the language and the idioms that we use were really brought into that biblical language, was really brought into English by William Tyndale. One author did a computer study of select portions of the King James Bible and tried to trace back to see how much of the King James Bible was actually just repeating William Tyndale. And the statistics that he came up with were that the New Testament was 83.7% just Tyndale retweeted. Because they were all heavily dependent on his work, and they wouldn't have viewed that as a bad thing. Today, we would call that maybe an act of plagiarism, but they were aiming for that, and it wasn't an immoral or wrong thing for them to do, and it wasn't an accident. They were very consciously trying to be conservative in their wording and to keep with the kind of language that Tyndale had produced. But yeah, he's really the father of English Bible translation.
So by the time there's a necessity for a new translation, we think of 1611, everybody kind of pins it to that particular year. But how does one go about simply deciding that a new translation should be made? Who's in a position to make that decision? I mean, we might think today of like Zondervan, a publisher, just decides, hey, we need a new marketable translation. But in those days, it wasn't the publisher's decision to do this. How did the decision come about to make a new translation, which would become the King James?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of it had to do with political realities. And we tend to think today of politics and religion as two separate things because of the American project and freedom of religion that we have here. In England at the time, religion and politics weren't two separate things. They were tightly bound together and essentially were one thing. So there was political / religious unrest because you had the Great Bible floating around and the Geneva Bible floating around, and they almost became emblems of different parties, if you will. That's probably too strong a term, but different factions of the Church of England, with Puritans gravitating towards the Geneva Bible, but that not being an official authorized Bible that the church had allowed for reading. So it wouldn't be read, for example, in the liturgy. If you came to church, nobody was allowed to read from the Geneva Bible. They were forced by royal injunction to read from the Great Bible. So there was this unrest about translation. And when King James took the English throne in 1603 and traveled down to England, one of the things that he decided to do was to listen to complaints from the people in England that were unhappy with the Elizabethan settlement, with the way religion had kind of settled in England at the time. So he received a bunch of petitions during his progress to England. One of them, a very famous one, was called the Millenary Petition. And it was called that because allegedly it was signed by 1,000 ministers. I don't think 1,000 ministers actually signed it, but they presented complaints to the king, none of which had to do with translation, but which had to do with the structure of the church, ceremonies in the church, the role of the Book of Common Prayer. And he decided to listen to those complaints. And so he called a conference that we today call the Hampton Court Conference at Hampton Court Palace in 1604, and decided to listen to what would be said. I don't think he ever gave a really genuine hearing, but was willing to see what are the problems going on in England, what are people upset about, what do we need to do to work towards peace and unity. And at that conference, on the second day of that conference, on Monday, John Reynolds proposed the idea of a new translation, and he pointed out problems that existed in the current Bibles and suggested, hey, what if we created a new English translation? There's a lot of scholarly debate and discussion about why Reynolds made that suggestion. What was it that motivated him? David Norton, for example, was of the opinion in his excellent work from Cambridge University Press, A Textual History of the King James Bible. He wasn't the first one to come up with this idea, but he's popularized it. And he has suggested that Reynolds really wanted to get the Geneva Bible authorized, that he said, hey, let's get a new Bible, but that he was pointing out problems in the Bible that weren't problems in the Geneva. So he was maybe just hoping the king would say, oh, okay, let's accept the Geneva as an acceptable authorized Bible that can be used in church. That's one view. There is another view that has been more recently advocated by Mordecai Feingold, and he argues that Reynolds really was dissatisfied even with the Geneva and wanted a new translation. There's some debate there. Regardless of what motivated it, as soon as Reynolds proposed the idea, James jumped on it. He loved it. He said, this is great. Yeah, we can make a new translation. James was a scholar. He had his own interest in biblical translation and biblical work. A lot of people don't realize James was the most prolific author or monarch that ever sat on the English throne. He published a collection of his works in 1616, and he was himself a translator. He had interest in biblical translation in Scotland. He tried to move the General Assembly there in 1601 to produce a new translation, which probably would have been a lowland Scots translation. He produced his own translation of the Psalms, although he may have been helped in that by sort of a ghostwriter. He wrote Meditations on Matthew, sort of a paraphrase of Revelation. So he had an interest in translation. And when Reynolds proposed this idea, James jumped all over it. This was perfect. He could sort of show off his scholarly power, cement his place as a king with biblical authority who speaks into biblical issues. And he hoped that it would also provide a healing of this divide in the English church between Puritans and conformists, and that there'd be just one uniform translation was the language that he used. So that's kind of what brought about that decision. And in 1604, he decided we're going to produce a new translation. And that was the conception, really, of the King James Bible.
Now, kind of a silly question here, but maybe some viewers might legitimately ask this question. The name, the King James Version, when did it kind of get that tag to it? And what about calling it the authorized version? Any comments on the naming of this translation?
Yeah, most definitely. That's a question I actually get a lot because I call my site King James Bible History or KJB History. It's interesting. When I was growing up in fundamentalism, we would often refer it to as the King James Bible and would mock those that called it a version. Like from the pulpit, I had said before, it's not a version of the Bible, it's the Bible. So that was kind of what drove us to King James Bible as a tag. I learned later that that's actually the appropriate scholarly name for it as well. David Norton's written some on this, and I'll point people to his work because it is an important question. There used to be a lot of debate. What should we call this Bible? And there was kind of a British name for it and an American name for it. American scholars tended to use King James Bible, whereas British scholars tended to speak of it as the authorized version. And Norton argues, I think he's exactly right, those two terms accidentally got conflated and gave us King James Version, which was really a misnomer. It was borrowing from both of those tags. There has always been a question of whether it was royally authorized, and so whether it deserves the term authorized. James's original intention at Hampton Court, when they proposed the idea, he said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make this new translation. After it's done, it will be ratified by my privy council and by my royal authority. And that part of the work never took place. So some would say, oh, it wasn't officially authorized. There was never an act of parliament that we know of that authorized the King James Bible. But if we use the word authorized in a looser sense, I think we can appropriately call it an authorized version because James did commission it as a royal king. But the term that scholars today all but universally use for it is King James Bible. I think probably largely because of Norton's influence. But I could make a list I've got on my shelf, 20 or 30 scholarly works on the King James in the last 2 decades. Every single one of them refers to it by the title King James Bible. And that sounds odd to some ears, but this is one of those cases where it turns out my fundamentalist background was right. And that actually is the term that is most scholarly accepted for it, and that is used now almost universally in academic writing on the text. It is the King James Bible, KJV for short. You can still use the acronym KJV. Cambridge still asks for that in their copyright, so you'll see that a lot. But King James Bible really is the appropriate term for it.
That ended up being a more interesting answer than I thought. I actually thought you were going to make fun of me for asking the question.
No, it's a good question. I get it a lot.
Yeah, it turned out to be pretty good. So after the Hampton Court, then they at some point get down to the business of actually translating this new version. So I'm working on the assumption here that the translators worked in various groups or companies. Can you tell us a little bit about how they divvied up the responsibilities, who got to translate what, how many camps were there, how many people were in each group, etc.?
Yeah, those are very good questions. There are different ways of charting out how the King James Bible was created. I've seen a few guys that chart out 6 or 7 different stages. The way that I chart things out is following Ward Allen, who was a major scholar on the King James. And I think I could argue that this categorization of the work goes all the way back to 1618 and Samuel Dort, who was a translator. But as I see it, and I think as Samuel Ward saw it and as Ward Allen saw it, the King James Bible was produced broadly in 3 stages. In stage 1, we have what I would call company drafts, company work, and I'll talk about that more here in just a second. And then in stage 2, after the companies had done their work, the whole text was sent to a revision committee that, according to Walker in his biography of Boyce, took place in 9 months during 1610. There has been some suggested recently that it was longer than 9 months. But however long it was, the stage 2 was what we call the general meeting. And at that meeting, 12 men revised the whole biblical text. And then in a third stage, what I would call finishing touches or final edits, Miles Smith, Thomas Bilson, and perhaps Richard Bancroft made some final tweaks to the text. But really the bulk of the work was done in what I would call that stage 1, company drafts. So what happened was James decided very early on that he wanted a large collection of scholars to work on this text. And in July 22nd, actually, of 1604, he wrote a letter to Richard Bancroft, who was then Bishop of London, shortly became Archbishop of Canterbury, which, if you're not familiar with the English system, is like the most important and powerful ecclesiastical role that you can hold in England, apart from the monarch himself. So the bishop, and then became Archbishop, is sort of the head of the project. And they decided to break the text down into 6 companies at 3 locations. So they would have a collection of scholars working at Cambridge, a collection working at Westminster, and a collection working at Oxford. And that collection of scholars would each have a team of Hebrew specialists and Greek specialists. So at each location, you've got a team of Hebrew guys and a team of Greek guys. So at Cambridge, the first company, the Hebrew company, takes First Chronicles through the Song of Songs, and then the Greek company takes the Apocrypha. At Westminster, under Leslott Andrews, the Hebrew company takes the Genesis to Second Kings, rather, and the Greek company takes the New Testament epistles. And then at Oxford, the Hebrew company takes the Old Testament prophets, the Greek company takes the Gospels, Acts, and Revelation. So they split up into these little groups, about 8 to 10 men per company, and they work on just their allotted portion of the text. What they were supposed to do, there's some question about how much they actually followed all these rules, but what they were supposed to do is each individual was supposed to suggest his own revisions, work through the text on his own, and when they came to their meetings, maybe a couple times a week, at those meetings of the whole company, there's maybe 8 or 9 men gathered around a table. They would bring their individual work and say, hey, what do you guys think about this? And agree together on what revisions would be made to the bishop's Bible. And then when that process was done, they would send it to stage 2. At stage 2 was that general meeting where people went over the whole biblical text. So there's a lot of scholars involved. James mentioned 54. There's some debate about the count today. There might have been as many as maybe 60 or so individuals who worked on the project. They're working in different locations in isolated little groups. And in fact, David Norton says that many of those companies probably subdivided. So a lot of the work may well have been done with just 3 or 4 men together in a room, working on a small portion of text for the course of several years and crafting a revision of the bishop's Bible. Then that revision committee in 1610 works over the whole text and gives us ultimately the King James Bible. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, that does. So you brought up the Bishop's Bible here, and let's talk about that for just a moment. So when people think of Bible translation, they may think of just scholars with a bunch of ancient Greek and Hebrew manuscripts lying on the desk and just kind of coming up with something from scratch, let's say. But you've mentioned the Bishop's Bible. Was this technically a revision of an existing Bible? And if so, how do the Hebrew and the Greek then work its way into what becomes the new translation?
Man, that is a very good question. So to step back into that political history in England, I mentioned, the Great Bible is an official revision, and then the Geneva Bible had been produced by Marian exiles in Geneva. Well, the established church was unhappy with that, And the first reaction to that was what's called the Bishop's Bible, which was a revision of the Great Bible, and became then the established text in England. But nobody liked it. I think personally, even some of the people who worked on it didn't like it. It just wasn't well done. So it became, quote unquote, the official Bible, but people didn't love it. And most people still preferred the Geneva, which was an unauthorized text. So when the King James was produced, James was adamant right from the start that he didn't want a lot of theological innovation. He didn't want them to start fresh. And translators typically make, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, but translators typically make one of two choices, or a choice about one of two directions when producing a text. They can either start completely fresh and put a Greek and Hebrew text in front of them and just translate directly from that text into a target language with no intermediary. And a lot of translations to do that. The NIV does that. The New Living Translation does that. A lot of translations that'll put new in their title. That's kind of what they're getting at. This is a fresh, brand new virgin translation, if you will, into English. The other way that a translation can be made is to take an existing English text and revise it in accordance with Hebrew and Greek backgrounds, but revise it so that there's still a lot of conservative retaining of that language. Well, James was
something like
adamant.
what the ESV would have done with the RSV.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The ESV, there was a revision of the RSV that was done in kind of a gender inclusive direction, a little bit more of a liberal direction, the New Revised Standard Version. And there was a conservative group that wasn't happy with the direction they'd taken the text. So they bought the rights to revise the RSV in a more conservative direction. So the ESV took an English text in front of them as their basis. Now, obviously, all the scholars that work there, I've been at Tyndale House where they did a lot of that work. They're all holding a Greek and Hebrew text in their hand. They're looking very closely at the original languages, but as much as possible, they're sticking with the language that has already been given to them in the Revised Standard Version. The King James Bible was exactly like that. It was a revision of the 1602 Bishop's text. The edition that they used was the 1602. We actually still have a bill that Robert Barker sent to the king from 1610 or from 1605 rather, where he charged him for 40 copies of the Bishop's Bible that were probably unbound sheets of pages. So those were divvied up among the translators, and the way that they did their work was to take a copy of the Bishop's Bible in front of them and cross out what was going to need to be changed, add things into the margin that were going to need to be added. So they were making a revision of the Bishop's text. Now, certainly, I don't want to leave the impression that that means that they didn't go back to Hebrew and Greek. They did.
Right.
Miles Smith made it very clear in the preface to the King James that the original fountains were the source of their work. So they were holding and looking at and consulting the standard Hebrew and Greek text of their day, probably the 1525 Berg Hebrew Old Testament. And for the New Testament, we know that they had in their hands at least the editions of Erasmus and Beza, because John Boyce mentions those in his notes, probably also made use of the editions of Stephanus. But yeah, they're working with the Hebrew and Greek text. But James's first rule for the translators was follow the text of the Bishop's Bible as closely as possible and only alter it where necessary, where the original languages require it. So it is a revision. The proper way to speak of the King James Bible is as a thoroughgoing revision of the 1602 text of the Bishop's Bible.
Now, you mentioned the Textus Receptus. We've talked a little bit about this on my channel on other occasions, as have you on other videos. But for the viewer that's maybe just dropping in here for this conversation, what exactly is the Textus Receptus, and how does that differ from the Greek text? In brief terms here, but how does it differ from the critical text that modern scholars might use today in a translation like the ESV, for instance?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a complex question, way more than we could go into in a little talk like this. Greek text of the New Testament are an attempt to put into a printed text a form of the text that hopefully is based on Greek manuscripts. For thousands of years, of course, as the Bible was copied, it was hand copied. And when someone produces a hand copy of the text, we refer to that as a manuscript. It's scripted by manus, the Latin word for hand. So it's a handwritten document. But beginning in 1514, with the Complutensian Polyglot, was the first printed Greek New Testament. And it didn't actually get published right away. The first published one was Erasmus in 1516. But editors began to sit down and say, we want, now that the printing press is here, now that we can produce a text with precision, we want to provide a printed text. And so they worked with those Greek manuscripts to produce a printed text of the Greek New Testament that was eclectic. They were not basing their work on one particular manuscript. They were consulting a number of different manuscripts, choosing readings between them, doing the work of a textual editor to produce a Greek text. We typically refer to those early printed Greek texts as the Textus Receptus,
Mm-hmm.
or one friend of mine actually suggests Texti Recepti, because there wasn't just one form of that text, there was a few. But
Mm-hmm.
basically what happened as Erasmus did his work became highly regarded, highly accepted and respected, and became kind of a basis for the next 200 years, really. And so for approximately 2 centuries, the form of the text stuck very closely to what Erasmus had done. There were every new edition of the Greek text, and there were many, many new editions of the Greek text, hundreds of them actually, in fact, probably before the King James, but they all stuck pretty closely until the 1800s, maybe the mid 1700s in a few editions. They stuck pretty closely to that same basic form of the text that Erasmus had created. So when people speak of the Textus Receptus, they're typically referring to that basic shape of the New Testament that was given by Erasmus of Rotterdam. There are a couple different ways that the phrase gets used. Probably it was first used in 1633 in an edition of the Elsevier brothers, and at the front of their text, Textum Receptum, they spoke of the text that's been received by all. And they just meant that common form of the text that has sort of become settled or congealed in that era. Today, of course, scholars don't typically feel bound by that particular shape of the text. So they do fresh work with manuscripts. They go back to manuscripts as we have them today, and we've discovered a great many more Greek New Testament manuscripts than were known in the 1500s. And in many cases, much older and earlier manuscripts. So they do fresh work today rather than starting with the Textus Receptus. You used the term critical text to describe that. That's fine. I personally would say that every edition of the Greek New Testament is a critical text. Every edition is an author, or an editor rather, making choices. But today's modern texts are based on modern, fresh work with the manuscripts, whereas Textus Receptus is a term that really refers to that early shape of the text given by Erasmus. I hope that can answer your question briefly.
No,
it is a complex issue.
That's fantastic. Would you say, just for simplicity's sake, that the modern critical texts that we have available to us today are the variations there are informed by some major discoveries of papyri and some other manuscripts that might not have been known in the days of Erasmus and Beza and the Elseviers, et cetera. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it. It's a complex question because there are a number of different directions that New Testament editors take today. So Maurice Robinson, for example, has his wonderful the Byzantine text form text. He is less concerned about some of the recent papyri discoveries and some of the discovery of the early codexes from the 4th and 5th century, the Pandects, that inform a lot of other textual work. So his New Testament text looks rather different from, say, like the NA28. That's kind of the standard text that most translators use. But yeah, whether it's Robinson or the NA28, any modern textual editor has the benefit, at least, of all of those manuscript discoveries of the early papyri, of the Pandects, of the early codexes from the 4th and 5th century. And we have, thousands of them, depending on how you count, probably 5,000 plus,
5,000 plus
Greek New Testament manuscripts. Whereas, when the early editors of the Textus Receptus were working, they were working with really a small number of manuscripts. I think Erasmus, by my count, used a dozen for his first edition. Probably added a few more in some of the later editions, and then as Beza and Stephanus and some of those guys did their work, they added a few more, but probably at most they're working with a few dozen manuscripts. Now, the form of text that they produced is generally representative of what's found in the majority of manuscripts. Not always, not in particulars, but generally speaking. But yeah, they're working with a smaller number. And in fact, they're probably working with less than 1% of the amount of textual data that's available to a textual scholar today. And again, that's a complex question that goes into all kinds of things that we can talk about more, but there's a lot more data available today for sure.
Well, let's go back to the process of translation itself. So every translation of the Bible has to kind of decide a few things ahead of time as to what kind of a translation they want to produce. And so the translators of the King James Bible obviously made some a priori decisions about what kind of a translation they want to make. What were some of these so-called rules? You mentioned earlier to try to stick with the Bishop's Bible if possible. Any other kind of rules that stick out as being fundamental to their mode of translation?
Yeah, absolutely. As James commissioned the translation, he sat down, I think probably with Richard Bancroft. There is some debate about this. But I think he and Richard Bancroft sit down and they actually crafted for the translators 14 rules that the translators were supposed to follow. And then a 15th one was added when some clarity was needed. And I'll just read a couple of them to you because they give a good sense of what the king was trying to do. The way I break it down, the first 5 rules are meant to conserve the past and prevent innovation. So they're all about a conservatism. So the first rule was this, the very first rule for the translators: the ordinary Bible read in the church, commonly called the bishop's Bible, to be followed and as little altered as the truth of the original will permit. So he's right up front saying, here's a base text that you're going to take. Yes, you're going to use the Hebrew and Greek, but here's a base text that I want you to stick with, and don't change it unless you have to. There's a conservatism there. The next several rules likewise have a conservatism. Rule 2, the names of the prophets and holy writers with the other names in the text to be retained as near as may be accordingly as the vulgarly used. So Jeremiah's forms of people's names that have been in place, don't innovate, don't change as much as possible, stick with the way that they've been used. Now, they didn't always keep that rule perfectly, but they tried. And then the third one too, there's some real conservatism politically in this third one. He says the old ecclesiastical words to be kept, for example, as the word church, not to be translated congregation. If we stepped back earlier into time to William Tyndale, one of the things that caused a lot of controversy was he would innovate terms and use them as he felt accurately to the Greek text, but that weren't necessarily the way the Latin Vulgate had been understood. So he would translate congregation. He would translate elder instead of priest. These were flashpoint controversies.
We Presbyterians like that decision.
Yeah. Presbyterians love the idea of elder as opposed to priest or bishop, right? Like a huge debate in the English church at the time is whether there should be an episcopacy. So those words became incredibly important. And James's rule rule number 3 was to say, stick with the past, stay conservative. Don't go crazy innovating new ideas. Keep all the old ecclesiastical words. We're not going to produce a sectarian translation. We're definitely not going to produce a Presbyterian or a Puritan translation. This is a translation of the establishment church. So there's a conservatism there. Same thing with the division of chapters and verses. They made some minor innovation there, but as much as possible, James wants them to stick to the same. But then the second collection of those rules, the second section rather, Rule 6 and 7, are meant to control the paratext and prevent anti-monarchical policy. So let me just read those to you. James was adamant right from the beginning that he didn't want this Bible to be loaded down with marginal notes. If you're familiar with the Geneva Bible or you've ever looked at a page of it,
it's like a study Bible.
Yeah, it is. It was actually really the first study Bible. I just wrote an article on the Geneva Bible for a dictionary that'll be coming out here before too long. And it was in a real sense the very first study Bible that said, here's loads of study aids for the reader to help them find their way into the biblical text. But of course, the problem with that is the moment you produce study aids, you're presenting a particular position theologically in those study notes. And James did not like the notes of the Geneva Bible. He thought they were anti-monarchical. He was very concerned about the fact that Asa deposed his mother. And some people had suggested from the text that there was even grounds there for killing a king. And here's James as a king. He's like, whoa, no. Nothing anti-monarchical. So his first rule stated even at Hampton Court, and one of the first things that everybody records that was there, James said there'd be a new Bible and there's not supposed to be notes. Now, there were marginal notes in the King James Bible, but anything that would be sectarian, that would be political, or that would be anti-monarchical, he was adamant that they wouldn't be there. So he gave this rule, number 6, no marginal notes at all to be affixed, but only for the explanation of Hebrew or Greek words, which cannot without some circumlocution be briefly and fitly explained in the text. Didn't want political commentary there that could challenge his authority. And then in Rule 7, such quotation of places to be marginally set down as shall serve for fit reference of one scripture to another. So yes, you can put cross references in the margin, you could put explanations of Hebrew and Greek words, but no political commentary. So that second set of rules is controlling the paratext and what it could present. He did not want Geneva 2.0. He wanted the crown to have a much closer control over what would show up in the text. And then just really briefly, the third set of those notes, and you can read through them on my website. If you go to my website, I've got all 14 of them listed there. But rules 8 through 13 were meant to craft the procedures and prevent partisan translation. So that list of the final rules basically says, here's how it's going to work. You're going to be divided in companies. Each company is going to have a head. The Regius professors of University of Cambridge and Oxford are going to be in control. When it's done, there'll be this general meeting that's going to work over the text together. And he kind of lays out how the translation is to work. There is debate. about how much the King James translators followed those rules. One of the earliest King James scholars, Ward Allen, actually not in this book, in one of another's that I don't have here, but Ward Allen was of the opinion that the translators basically followed every rule to the T. That's not generally the prevailing opinion today. David Norton, Mordecai Feingold, others that write on the text today think that they followed them a lot more loosely. And then I believe Nick Hardy plans to argue in his new work with Yale University Press on the King James. I haven't talked to him in several years, so I'm not sure about this, but I believe he plans to argue that they basically didn't follow the rules at all. That's what he told me in private conversation a couple of years ago. And I'm paraphrasing him. I don't want to put words in his mouth. I don't know exactly how he'll express it. It's not published yet, but he seemed to be basically of the opinion that they really didn't stick by the rules very closely at all and sort of did their own thing. So there is scholarly debate there. But whether they followed them or not, James was very adamant about a list of procedures that they were to follow as they produced the King James.
Now, the Translators to the Readers is a preface that is attached to many King James versions of the Bible in print form, though I've seen some that don't have the Translators to the Readers at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about that document? When was it crafted? Who wrote it? And highlight just some of its main points. And we'll have to work a little bit quickly here if we can, but give us an overview of the Translators document.
Yeah, just very briefly, in a collection of sermons from Miles Smith published in 1632, his biographer explains a little bit, and I'm putting words in his mouth because I don't have it in front of me, but basically he explains that after the text was completed, Miles Smith was commissioned to write a preface in the name of all the translators. So he's the sole author of the preface. He's the only one that sat down and worked on it. But he was trying to speak not for himself, but for the translators as a whole. There is some debate about how well he did that and how much he actually represented all the voices. There are some spots in the preface where I think he did not do a great job of representing everybody. But yeah, Miles Smith sat down and penned this preface to the King James Bible. It's divided with marginal subheadings if you follow it along. And I am writing right now a work on the preface. I don't have any idea when it'll be finished or when it'll be published. But he basically is making an argument for the new translation. Remember, not everybody wanted a new translation. Most people loved the Geneva. Some people were tied to the bishop's text. So they have to make a case essentially for why there should be a new translation of the Bible. And Miles Smith's preface, in large part, is just one large argument against the idea that translations shouldn't be revised, that translations shouldn't be changed, that we should just stick with what we have. And he says, no, there's a place for new work, there's a place for revision, and there's a place on your shelf for this new revision of the bishop's Bible. And that's the gist of the preface to the reader in just a sentence or two.
Would it be fair to say that the Translators to the Readers opens up the possibility that the King James Version itself might be revised one day?
Yeah, I absolutely think it does. I use the term textual absolutism if people wanted to go to textual confidence or textualconfidencecollective.com or textualconfidence.com. Recently did a series of videos, and we kind of divide views on the text of Scripture. And I use the term textual absolutism to delineate the idea that the text should never be revised. Whether it's talking about the Greek and Hebrew text, a translation of that text, there is a mentality, and it's very old, it's respected, it's got a very respectable historical lineage of people who tend to latch on to one particular form of the text and say, don't touch it, don't revise it.
Like the Septuagint, let's say.
Yeah, like the Septuagint, very early on.
Or the Latin Vulgate.
Christians. Yeah, or the Latin Vulgate. It actually happens in a bunch of different languages, and it has happened today in terms of how some people view the Textus Receptus, how some people view the King James. They get this mentality that it should never be revised or altered, what I call textual absolutism. I think you could actually show that Miles Smith's preface is basically one long argument against textual absolutism, because he's arguing for a revision of the Bible. He's saying, here's this revision. We've changed it. We've adapted it. We've made alterations. And so he presents really a solid biblical, theological, and historical case for revising our editions of the Bible. Now, he doesn't mean revising what God actually wrote, not changing God.
Yes.
But in terms of the translations that we have, the text that we have, he's really arguing we should keep doing that work. We should keep making revisions to get better and better. He uses the phraseology of rubbing and polishing.
Right.
You're trying to shine a piece of brass and you rub and polish, but you just got to keep rubbing and keep rubbing and keep rubbing if you want the thing to really shine.
Yeah.
And he made that analogy to the biblical text to say, man, we should keep at it. Scholars should keep working at it as we learn more about Greek and Hebrew. He didn't say all this exactly like this, but as we discover more manuscripts, as we learn more about translation, let's keep rubbing and keep polishing.
Yeah, and just to clarify, for the sake of the viewer, we're not talking about changing the word of God. You would be grossly misunderstanding us if you think we're talking about changing the word of God. What we're talking about is the fact that language itself is in flux. Languages change over time. Goodness, I'm 45 years old right now, and the English language has changed dramatically and is changing dramatically practically every year as new words take on new nuances, and some become obsolete, other new words are coined. And so jumping into any language is like jumping into a moving river, right? There's constant flux and change to it. So we're talking about ensuring that the word of God is intelligible to every people in every age. That's kind of the big idea right here. Well, Timothy, let's wrap up with some thoughts on the recognition and the legacy then of the King James Version. Obviously, it was tremendously successful. People don't even, well, not everybody, some people have never even heard of the Bishop's Bible or the Great Bible or even the Geneva Bible. But it seems that everybody knows something of the King James Bible. So obviously it landed with quite a splash, let's say. So tell us about its initial reception maybe, and then a little bit about its long and stalwart and excellent legacy that it has.
Man, that's great. I appreciate that question. The King James Bible has an unrivaled legacy in comparison to any other English translation. For centuries, from probably about the 1660s to the 1880s, so a little over 2 centuries there, it was essentially the Bible in English. And anytime anyone talked about the Bible, they never needed to offer any other qualifiers in that period of time. When people talked about the Bible, they meant the King James Bible. It rose to dominance in the 1660s and just a universal appeal until newer translations gained a little bit more acceptance. There were always other translation projects, but not always as well accepted. There has been some debate about how quickly the King James Bible earned that title. David Norton, again, we've mentioned him. He argued that the King James Bible was not loved when it first came out, that it really wasn't even liked, and that most people didn't prefer to use it. And in his understanding, it was political realities that forced the Geneva Bible, an embargo on the Geneva Bible. It had to be shut down and then shut out of England. And that's why the King James Bible came to dominance, because it was cheaper, it was easier to produce, and there were political realities in its favor. There has been a different proposal in more recent years, and I used to accept Norton's proposal, and I now think he's wrong. Mordecai Feingold has argued this, and then I don't know where I've got it, but sitting there somewhere, Reese and Wakely have argued that the King James Bible was actually popular right away. The moment it came out, you can see it start to be quoted in sermons, writings, devotionals. People loved it and used it because it was such a beautifully and well done product. And then once the Geneva did disappear, and there were some political realities that were at work because of the English Civil Wars and some of what happened there. England essentially came to settle on one translation, and it spread from there to the rest of the world and became incredibly well known. There's a marvelous collection of essays called The King James Bible Across Borders and Centuries. And it's a wonderful group of scholars that sit down and asked, if we were to trace the global impact of the King James Bible, what would that look like? And it has just spread everywhere. It's had a massive impact in Australia. It's had a massive impact in India. And of course, in the English speaking world until the 1880s in America had just a universal dominance. Yeah, it's a beautiful, fantastic, well done translation that has a long and lasting legacy.
Yes. Well, in my strange noise happening in the background there. In my world, I'm a Jonathan Edwards scholar, and you can't really do Edwards scholarship if you're not familiar with the King James Version. Edwards was using it, Spurgeon, Wesley, George Whitefield is using it. Of course, many of these great and very influential figures that many of us look to, and especially in Presbyterian circles, we look back to many of these great writers, thinkers, pastors, and theologians who are heavily dependent on the King James Version. And so just by way of conclusion, I just want to encourage anybody out there, if you do use modern translations, as I've preached from the ESV, please incorporate the King James Version into the regular diet of your devotional life and your study life. I think you'll be very richly rewarded for it. Though there are certain phrases that do seem antiquated at times, and perhaps
Sure.
phraseology that's become obsolete, there's no question that it is a rich treasure for any English-speaking believer to delve into. And I almost feel that you'd be at a great spiritual loss if the King James
Yeah.
Version wasn't part of your regular reading, prayer, devotional life. Any final thoughts for you, Timothy, on the impact of the book?
Yeah, well, I would say maybe right along those lines, I would encourage every Christian to get and read a copy of the King James Bible. If you speak English, you should read it. You'll be, for one thing, you'll be cutting off a part of English culture if you just aren't familiar with it. It's just such a massive cultural landmark, but also just the beauty of the translation and the elegance. I don't think there's ever been a more elegant translation, and I don't think there will ever be a more elegant translation. So I do encourage every Christian who speaks English to get a copy of the King James Bible. I don't think anyone should claim that we should only use the King James Bible. I think that's a dangerous claim,
Yep.
and it's theologically unhealthy. But I do think every Christian would benefit from it, and I encourage you to get one, read it regularly, soak in its pages. For centuries, great men like you've named, Edwards and Spurgeon and others, great men have met Jesus in its pages, and you can too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if you don't know where to start, I would say the Psalms are just an amazing book to work through. Use that as a prayer guide for your devotions in the morning. Pray them out loud. Pray them silently if you want to. Read the Gospels in the King James Version. But it would be great for all the viewers out there to, at some point in your life, set on that wonderful and glorious journey of starting in Genesis 1:1 and ending up in the end of Revelation. Go all the way through the King James. But if you really want to be blessed, I'll just leave it with this. Read the Psalms in the 90s, 90 through 100 in the King James Version. It'll be a joyful moment for you to do that very thing. Well, Timothy, thank you so much for coming on my channel today. Do you want to shout out any books or your blog or your church? Why don't you give us, let's end on a high note here and tell us what we need to read or follow up on.
Absolutely. Again, I would welcome anyone that's in the area to come by Bridgeway Church. I'll actually be preaching this Wednesday for our youth. I preach for youth in college and different areas like that occasionally. So you're welcome to come to that. Drop in Sunday morning. If you do stop by Bridgeway, find me on Facebook and send me a message. I'll accept just about any friend request on Facebook if you look like a legit person. And you can send me a message. We'll meet up in the foyer and I'll save you a seat for sure. So by all means, drop by there. Also, if you're interested in the history of the King James Bible, I do blog regularly. I was out for a while, but I'm hoping to get back to blogging regularly at kjbhistory.com. And then I'll also post there eventually as I get a couple of articles that I'm working on right now published. So yeah, follow me at kjbhistory.com and you can find us there or hit me up for personal correspondence.
All right. Well, hey, everybody, thanks for checking in today. So very glad you joined us for this lesson. I hope it was of benefit to you and to your soul. That's it for today. Again, thanks for checking in. Do love you lots, and we'll talk to you later.